We all inherit characteristics from our parents, good or bad, be it black hair that hopefully doesn't disappear with age, brown eyes, or essentially almost any trait you can think of. I'm Stephen Hong, and I'm part of the MIT class of 2020. Currently, I'm studying at Cambridge University. As you can tell, I have black hair, brown eyes, and hopefully I don't develop male pattern baldness later in life. Now, from the healthcare side of things, knowing what you've inherited is clearly important. Maybe your parents passed on to you a certain disease or predisposition to a disease. This is why genetics is a well-established and continually growing field of research. It can help us figure out what you might have and how we might go about treating it. One of the most well-known examples of a genetically linked disease is diabetes. In the United States, about 1 in 10 people have type 2 diabetes. You probably are close with someone who has it. Now, when we talk about diabetes, we jump into this big debate of nature versus nurture. Nature, which is your genetics, plays a role in that, but other factors in your environment, i.e. nurture, your income, your education level, there are so many factors that can influence your likelihood of type 2 diabetes. One study, for example, showed that poorer US counties have more than twice the obesity rate compared to wealthier counties. And as you probably know, obesity leads to a really high likelihood of developing diabetes. In fact, it's probably our best predictor of whether you have diabetes right now. So much so that very often diabetes and obesity are somewhat synonymous. But that's a problem, and here's why. Asian people like myself have this trait where we can look quite lean but have type 2 diabetes. This is why we're 3 times more likely to have undiagnosed diabetes than our white counterparts. It turns out that Asian people develop diabetes at much lower BMIs and body fat percentages than their white counterparts. My dad was a perfect example of this. He was a pretty lean person, and he'd go to the doctor confused as to why he was always so thirsty and lightheaded. So because he didn't look like the typical American with diabetes, the doctors didn't test him for it. So he was diagnosed so late in his disease that his body had already been seriously damaged. This question of why do Asian people develop diabetes, even though we're lean, has intrigued me ever since I was little. When I was a kid, my dad would always tell me, be careful of the carbs. And if you have any clue about Asian culture, though, you know how crazily difficult it is to avoid the carbs. We have rice for breakfast and rice for lunch and rice for dinner, plus other stuff we probably shouldn't. But being careful and being proactive isn't always enough, though. It really isn't. My father, despite basically cutting out most of the carbs in his diet, despite being really thin, passed away due to his diabetes complications not too long ago. I came to MIT wanting to study type 2 diabetes to figure out why, by virtue of just being born Asian, I had to be careful of how much rice I could eat. I also did it for my father. And I'd say that passion still lives in me today because that's the only thing I really want to study now. One thing I did at MIT was to look directly into this issue. Without any real expectations, I applied for a research grant called the El Arantza Fellowship. And what do you know? They said, yes, go ahead and see what you can discover. With the help of a very driven group of doctors in Ho Chi Minh City, I used the grant to start a study investigating the genetic basis of type 2 diabetes in Vietnamese people. Basically, we recruited patients at the hospital in Ho Chi Minh City and collected their DNA. With their DNA, now we can determine what genetic factors might predispose them to type 2 diabetes. But because our study is relatively small, we are limited in what it can conclude. However, we found a variant on one gene that regulates fat metabolism that may predispose Vietnamese people to type 2 diabetes. We're about to publish these findings, actually. More importantly, though, this study has opened up the door for future studies. In fact, several months ago, we officially secured funding from the National Foundation for Science, Technology, and Development of Vietnam. And now we can do an even larger study on the DNA we already have. In fact, we're hoping to expand our small-scale study into what's called a genome-wide association study, or GWAS. With a GWAS, we can look at the entire genome. In our study right now, we've only been able to look at one relatively tiny part of the genome. And for a complex disease like diabetes, you have to look at all these little sections and add them up to see what's going on. These GWAS studies have tremendous potential. In fact, using the resources of a particular dataset called the UK Biobank, scientists have been able to make amazing predictions. For example, scientists have been able to predict height within roughly an inch. They can even somewhat predict risk for breast cancer. One big caveat with this, though, we haven't been able to make good predictions with complex diseases like diabetes, where so many genes and so many environmental factors play a role. And of course, that's what matters to me. There's also a huge problem with these predictions. As with any algorithm, predictions will only be as good as the data you feed into them. And the fact is, the UK Biobank dataset is composed of about 95% of white individuals and 5% of every other racial group. This selection wasn't intentional. It just represents the demographic breakdown of the UK as it currently is. And this isn't to say that the UK Biobank isn't successful in some regards. It's given us so much insight, but like any study, it had its limitations. So in other words, these algorithms can make great predictions if you're white and British, but if you belong to any other group, well, kind of tough luck. Here's why this matters more than you might think, though. In the United States, African Americans are twice as likely to develop type 2 diabetes compared to their white counterparts. And this racial disparity is widening. Why is this the case? Why do minorities in general in the United States develop diabetes so much more often? We can't possibly ask these algorithms to figure out why when we aren't giving them the right data. Now, with a little MIT funding, I was able to kickstart Something Vietnam. Hopefully, it not only sheds a little light onto these questions, but also brings more awareness to this issue of representation in general. I hope you uplift those underrepresented in whatever fields you represent, because if this talk has any message, it's that a little can go a long way. A little can really make a better world. Thank you for listening.